Welcome to Unit 2, Section 1. Unit 2 is Ancient Greece, as you guys know, and we will be talking about, in this section, the early people and of the Aegean. And when we say the Aegean, the reason we're talking about that is the Aegean Sea separates Italy from Greece. It's the sea that kind of jolts into the and I'm sorry, not Italy, the Greece from Turkey, and it separates these two areas in this little inlet here of the Mediterranean. And so we're going to be talking about the earliest people here. So we're not really going to be talking about Sparta yet or Athens. We're going to be talking a little bit before that about a group called the Mycenaeans and the Minoans. So really, real main area that we're going to be talking about here is the mainland Greece, and then also this island here called Crete or Knossos. Okay. So here's our objectives. Our focus question for this unit is going to be, how do I analyze information and make my own opinion about it? So there are so many conflicting. I mean, look at the news today and all the conflicting information out there. With that being said, right, like how do we take all that information in and how do we make educated opinions about that? That's really one of the most important things I could ever teach you in history, is how to do that, both historically as well as in current events, because there's so much misinformation and there's just so much, not even misinformation, but just information that people only read parts of, and so then they only get a part of the story, and then they really start to frame opinions about things that they just don't know anything about. So that's our focus question. How do I analyze information and make my own opinion about it? Then objective 1, what is the difference between the Minoans and the Mycenae, or the Mycenaeans? Okay, so we're going to be talking about them. Objective 2, who was Homer and why was he important? And objective 3, how can literature help us understand the past? So this is going to be an important period. Is a lot of times we think of history, and we rightfully should probably think of history as most of the time being primary sources that don't have any kind of fantasy or literature in it. But the idea that like literature is separate from history is really not true at all, and I'll hopefully demonstrate that to you guys today. And so those are our 3 objectives for this unit. So let's talk first about Crete, or this very first area here. This island is, as you saw in the very beginning, is just a little island south of the mainland part of Greece, okay? So if you look at Greece, it's made up of tons of little islands and peninsulas, and Crete is this big one down here, okay? And Crete had a capital or a city-state called Knossos. And this is home to the Minoan people. So we're first talking about the Minoans. The Mycenaeans we'll talk about here in a second. Okay? So this is the main palace, it's the main city-state, and it's really one of the most important places on the entire island. So let's talk about the Minoans here for a second. So this is not Greece, this is predates Greece, okay? Uh, Crete was the cradle of this early civilization. When we say cradle, we're talking about, like, like a cradle for a baby. It's like the beginning. It's kind of like a metaphor, or it's kind of like a word to help describe the very beginning or origin of a group of things. So this is the cradle of Greek culture, okay, and European ideology. The people of Crete had absorbed many different ideas, some of them from Egypt, some from Mesopotamia, but they had incorporated a lot of different ideas and cultures from other places. And this was an area really known for its sea trading, because obviously if you live in Greece or anywhere in this Greek kind of area, the islands, the peninsulas, the sea is going to be tremendously important to you. Rather it be getting food or other commercial items from it, or be sailing around to do trading or whatever it is, the sea is going to be really, really important. And Crete is no different. There's these things called straits. Now, a strait, like, a straight line, right? But this is spelled differently if you look here. This is spelled Strait instead of GH, right? And it's spelled like that because what they're talking about is this very narrow passage of water between one body of water and another body of water. So let me give you guys an example here, okay? I'm going to get my pointer here ready. So let's look at a strait in this map over here, okay? So right here, see, this is a very famous strait between Turkey and, Turkey and Turkey, okay? This strait right here connects it over into the Black Sea. See how it's a big body of water with a small sliver of another water that connects it to another big water? So that's a strait. Here's another strait, right? This is a strait that comes into here. Here, another strait, right? So these are different examples of straits that kind of come in and really set this place up. The Minoans are very familiar with water. And as you can see archaeologically, we can even prove this. Look at this vase that we have from this time period, and look at an octopus is on it. So we know that sea and the sea animals and all that kind of stuff really played a big impact on Minoan civilization. We also know a couple other things about the Minoans. Number one, we know that that they were a very intelligent group of people, very brilliant early civilization, very well evolved. Okay, they were by the Aegean Sea. We've already kind of established that. The Minoan civilization reached its height and its greatest success, kind of what we call the Golden Age, between 1750 BC and 1500 BC. So it's going to last, that Golden Age, I should say, for about 250 years. A couple other things that we know is the Minoans based on trade, not conquest. So a lot of civilizations we've talked about, the way that they were successful is because they somehow were, taking over other places. Well, the Minoans are different. They don't go and like destroy and conquer. Instead, they learn, they trade, they adapt, and they do it that way. Okay, doesn't mean they didn't have competition and they didn't try to have an edge over other people, but they didn't go to war like a lot of civilizations did. Through their contact of Egypt and Mesopotamia, they were able to acquire lots of different things, ideas, technology, their own technology, and adapting it from the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. What we call this is cultural diffusion. That's a word that we really haven't talked about before, but it's an important word because cultural diffusion is when different cultures, thus cultural for our word here, is diffused or sent to other places, right? Is sent out. So cultural diffusion, when one culture's ideas, viewpoints, ideology are sent out into the rest of the world. Okay, and so the Minoans are a great example of this. Their palace was at a place called Knossos. Okay, it was a very large palace. It was very, very nice, very large. Okay, the palace had all sorts of shrines that were dedicated to different gods and goddesses. So this is important because it helps us understand where the Greek civilization got its own gods and goddesses. They're not identical by any means. They definitely were adapted, but they have connections for sure. And this would be another example of cultural diffusion. The walls were covered with these beautiful frescoes and watercolor paints, which tells us again that this was not just some, struggling civilization. This had to have been a thriving civilization. Anytime you have a civilization that is dedicating time, resources, energy, labor to, preserving historical things through paint, you know that the civilization cannot be too bad off, because how could they afford it? Most civilizations, especially the struggling ones, are focused just completely on food. These frescoes showed that even women at this time had many different rights as well, and so this is kind of an interesting time period that women in this civilization, at least, were able to have many different rights. So here's kind of a palace picture of what Knossos would have looked like. Okay. This would be the palace. It would be also a place that many people, not just like, the ruler themselves would have been at. Would have many people would have been here. This is kind of the archaeological dig and what we found so far. So this would have looked like this, or at least what archaeologists think. So as we keep going, the Minoan civilization, it ends up disappearing. Now the question is how. It vanishes about 1400 BC. There's not really a clear exact reason why. I'm going to say that the most leading example, or most leading reason why, is that some invaders who were called the Mycenaeans came in and took and destroyed their civilization. The Mycenaeans were the first Greek-speaking people and the first ones to have written records. And we do know this. We know that they got a tremendous amount of their culture, their technology, their abilities from the Minoans. We do know that. Now, rather that's just cultural diffusion or it's because they went in and killed and conquered them, that's not so clear. But I believe personally that they did go in and they conquered this area. There's a lot of other ideas though. There's the idea of tsunamis and other bad weather, things that went and destroyed the Minoans. There is a lot of evidence that suggests that there was probably some natural disasters that came. Now, rather those natural disasters came and wiped out things after they had already been wiped out or before, that's again still up for debate. So here we have Mycenaean and Minoan civilization, okay? And then we're going to see this turn into the Mycenaeans and the Hittites. So the Mycenaeans eventually we know take over this area. Rather they killed and got rid of the Minoans, or they just inherited it later, or they kind of came together, whatever. But we know that the Mycenaeans are going to be this yellow, and this group called the Hittites are going to be the purple. So the Mycenaeans were an Indo-European people, so they're different from the Minoan people. They conquered the Greek mainland, and that's where they're from originally, is that they conquered that area. And before overrunning Crete, before they went into Crete, they had conquered this mainland area. So they had come down and conquered all of this area before they had come over to Crete. They were also successful sea traders, done very well for themselves. They dominated the Aegean world from about 1400 to 1200 BC, so about 200 years. They learned a exceptional amount from the Minoans, okay? And most of us would conclude that they even got their writing from the Minoans. Now, what's really important about the Mycenaeans is they lived in city-states on the mainland, and each of these city-states had a warrior king who would then build a city-state with thick walls and a fortress around the areas. Now, that's important because this idea that Greece is a unified empire fighting together is just, it's not true. Even at the earliest time period, we're not into Greece yet. We're still talking about the Mycenaeans, but the Greeks will come from the Mycenaeans, and definitely it's true to say that they were not united in any way. If we kind of come back to our very, well, even just this picture, we can see that there's different groups, right? Different city-states, Pylos, Tympius, Mycenae, right? Those are different ones there. But even if we go back to the very, very beginning, the front cover, we see this is really what Greece is going to be. It's full of different cities. Ionia, Athens, Sparta, right? There's going to be all sorts of different city-states. And these people have a common background. They have a common ethnicity, common language, common gods, but they also have some major differences in themselves. And so they're not going to be like buddy-buddy family, okay? So we know that the Mycenaeans at some point in time got into a big, big conflict with the Trojans. So this is where we start reading about the Odyssey, and this is Homer would have written the Odyssey, or would have been at least not written it, but he would have been telling the story about the Trojans. And this is really a big deal. Now here's why. Going back to our first map, and I know this must be so frustrating, I keep going back and forth. Troy would have been in this area here in Turkey. Now, really, for a very recent amount of time, historians thought that was a completely fake, fictitious place. The only thing we knew about Troy was that it was mentioned in a book from Homer. And Homer talks about all sorts of things, right? Weird things like cyclopses and gods and goddesses. So like we never really took much truth to that. But then what we have is a problem because archaeologically, all of a sudden somebody in I think it was the late 1800s was searching around and they accidentally discovered the city of Troy. And this is a big deal because this teaches us something about literature and how important literature can be to history. So let's talk a little bit more about that. The legend is that this was all caused over a woman named Helen. Helen was supposed to be one of the most beautiful women in the world. She was a woman. She was a Greek, and she was taken by the Trojans. Okay, now again, most people thought that this was completely legendary until 1870 when Heinrich Schliemann excavated the ancient city of Troy. So not long after the fall of Troy, the Mycenaean civilization itself crumbled and it was destroyed. The Dorians, a Greek-speaking people, invaded that northern area. From about 1100 to 800 BC, society began to decline. People forgot most of their skills. So we kind of look at this as like, you had the Mycenaeans, the Minoans. The Mycenaeans take over, and the Mycenaeans then are taken over by the Dorians. And this is going to lead to really a dark time in Greece, a dark age where people learn all these great things that Greeks had known before, writing and the architecture and the painting and stuff. It's going to be lost because of the Dorians and the destruction of civilization in general. We know about this period primarily because of a man named Homer. Homer wrote two books, or he didn't write. He had two books, or two books that he told, called the Iliad and the Odyssey. These works are credited to Homer. We actually don't know for sure if he did or didn't write them, but we have no reason to believe he didn't either. And Homer's a really pretty interesting guy. He was a blind poet who wandered from village to village. And how did he make his money? He told these stories. These stories are important symbols of Greek culture, Greek attitude, and Greek life. Now, it's important for you to think and remember. So, when Homer's living, he's living during this Dorian period where there is a lot of loss of knowledge of things. He's living in a very difficult time. Where the time period he's talking about was when the Mycenaeans took over all these places. So, he's going back to a great time period of the Greeks. Now, he doesn't tell these things by writing the stories and having people read them. He tells them by orally speaking to them from one generation to another. And some of the people who heard the stories are going to write them down, and that's how we're going to have the Odyssey and the Iliad. The Iliad is the primary source for the Trojan War itself. That and another book called the Aeneid, both of them are primary sources. His poems inspired many other European writers and artists. Homer is one of the most influential poets of all time, and very, very important to all of the things we're talking about here. So that's the end of our notes here. Not a lot, like I said, but let's make sure we've got all of our objectives answered and just review that real quick. So what is the difference between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans? I think one of the big differences, the Minoans were a trading group of people, and that's how they got all their information, all their goods, all their stuff is through trade. Where the Mycenaeans were much more warlike. They craved war, they performed wars, they did all sorts of things. Who was Homer and why was he important? Homer was a blind poet who was important because he taught people the ancient histories of their past. And how can literature help us understand the past? Help us because if we stop taking some of the stories that we hear as completely fictitious and try to understand them a little bit more, we might be able to discover bigger and bigger truths. Again, a case for this would be like the Bible. People forever have been taking the Bible and trying to make light of it. But what people forget is that the Bible is a very, very important document because it teaches us so much about the culture, the attitudes, the viewpoints of that area. And so the same thing with Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey. It teaches us a great deal about ancient civilizations and the Greeks specifically. So that's our objectives, guys. I hope you got all the answers there. Let me know if there's any questions that you have so we can go over them again. Thanks.